Wouldn't it be cool if there existed a super efficient transportation technology? One that could move people and freight like 500 miles on a single gallon of gas? Or even better, what if it was able to be electrified, but it didn't rely on batteries? Imagine if every community in the country was connected by this super efficient electrified transport system. Maybe it could even double as a backbone for a national supergrid, transmitting renewable energy from windy places to not windy places and rural places to urban centers. It would have to be really, really big, even bigger than our 48,000-mile interstate highway system. It turns out that the bones of this actually already exist. The U.S. has a 140,000-mile network that we started building before the Civil War. It uses steel wheels on steel tracks, which has 10 times less friction and is way more efficient than rubber tires on pavement. Obviously, I'm talking about railroads. In many parts of the world, trains are powered by electricity from overhead wires, and rail corridors have long been used for communication and transmission. Nothing about this vision is strange or unprecedented. I'm Bill Moyer, and this is Reconnect America, a podcast about how rail transport and the corridors trains operate on offer potential solutions to some of the most vexing problems of our time. So, why aren't people talking about utilizing this super cool, critical national infrastructure to solve problems? Well, maybe it's because, unlike the rest of the world, and unlike our own interstate highways, most of the U.S. rail infrastructure is not owned by the public. In fact, most of the U.S. rail system is owned and controlled by a handful of corporations, and those corporations would quite prefer that the public pay them no attention whatsoever. Which brings me back to 1977, when I snuck the tape recorder I'd bought with my paper route money into the first Star Wars movie.
How long have you had these droids?
About 3 or 4 seasons.
They're up for sale if you want them.
Let me see your identification.
You don't need to see his identification.
We don't need to see his identification.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the railroad companies are cool like Obi-Wan Kenobi. What I am saying is that for the last 45 years, the deregulated railroad industry has bamboozled elected officials and the public into not paying attention by telling us that they are not the droids we are looking for, when in fact, they are exactly the droids we are looking for. U.S. railroads have so much potential for serving public interests and solving societal problems, but instead, they are bending over backwards to rake in record profits for shareholders. How? By reducing costs, by laying off workers, skimping on maintenance, and reducing service. They've even been tearing out track. There's a thing they refer to as precision scheduled railroading, and yes, you are hearing air quotes, and it turns out to not exactly be precise and not exactly be about schedules, and according to people who actually care about running railroads, not really about railroading. It's about one thing, and that is profit maximization. For years, they've been shooting for a 60% operating ratio. That's 40 cents profit on every dollar, which is absurdly high. For comparison, trucking companies net like 5 cents on the dollar, maybe 10 cents if they're really lucky. Sure, the railroad companies are supposed to be reinvesting that in new capacity, but instead, they use those resources for dividends and stock buybacks. By decreasing the number of shares, they increase the value of each share. The shareholders love this. Wall Street's all over this. To accomplish this, the railroad companies have basically been chasing away all the less profitable freight. I didn't say unprofitable, but all the less profitable freight. So, If they make 10% on a shipment, that's not good enough. They'd rather have it go by truck. So what's the impact of that? That pushes more and more trucks onto the public roads. And that's terrible for the public because all of a sudden you've got more congestion, more greenhouse gases, more pollution, and more accidents. So people are literally dying because of this precision scheduled railroading idea. Which brings up this basic question. What is infrastructure for? Who is infrastructure supposed to serve? When was the last time we asked a freeway to turn a profit? Waterways are controlled by the federal government. The federal highway system is controlled and maintained by the federal government. That's publicly owned infrastructure, and it exists to support a functional society. So here we are at a moment when we are desperate for actual solutions, and the railroads are actually a solution hiding in plain sight for a bunch of different things. Hiding because they don't want us to be paying attention to them. Well, over the last few years, the public has begun to pay attention. Remember the supply chain crisis with all those ships stuck offshore and shelves empty and inflation kicking in? Part of that was because the railroads had gotten rid of so many workers and so much track, and they couldn't even manage a predictable surge in demand. Or how about the national freakout in 2022 when Congress and the president refused to allow the railroad workers to actually strike because, God forbid, these employees who work like 19-hour shifts with no predictable schedule, who are responsible for this highly dangerous equipment, might actually need more than one sick day a year. Remember the disastrous derailment in East Palestine, Ohio in 2023? And how it revealed Norfolk Southern's disregard for safety? Which, by the way, is why they're now paying $1 billion in legal settlements. People are starting to pay attention to what the railroad industry is doing. And some people are even starting to talk about how the industry's problems should be fixed. But that could be asking the wrong question. Maybe instead of asking how we can help the railroads, we should be asking how the railroads can help us. In 2016, I co-authored the book Solutionary Rail, a people-powered campaign to electrify America's railroads and open corridors to a clean energy future. Since then, my organization, called Solutionary Rail, has been talking with folks from all walks of life and every corner of the country, including railroad workers, policymakers, community and technical experts, about the ways that rail can bring us together and help us confront such varied problems as political polarization, highway congestion, and transitioning our grid to renewable energy. Together, their ideas and energy constitute the seeds of a powerful movement. This podcast aims to share those voices, those ideas, and that energy with you, because no matter who you are or what you do, you have a stake in this. Learn with us as we explore the complexities of this critical national infrastructure, its history, and its potential to reconnect America. Our series begins by looking at the gradual dismantling of our national rail system over the past 50 years. Its withdrawal of service from rural areas and small manufacturers, and the deterioration of service even for major shippers. We'll talk about the social costs of having so much freight moved by truck and the social benefits that are already being reclaimed in states that have prioritized shifting freight back onto trains.
So these trains aren't even making it to where they're supposed to go.
The railroads cannot run trains.
Deregulation rescued the railroad corporations and destroyed rail transportation.
The fact that they passed through 400 small towns between Chicago and Seattle has become irrelevant to them.
We lost a lot of small town elevators and fertilizer companies. They needed the railroad to ship on.
To start, you're going to hear from Maddock Thomas, who recently authored the paper Putting America Back on Track, the case for a 21st century public rail system. In this clip, Maddock describes the railroad industry's pivot towards what many people call a doing less with less business model and what he describes as managed decline.
There is a lot of trackage and a lot of rail service that has been cut over the last 100 years, even the last 40 years, that would be really useful to have. It would be at least societally beneficial to have, both passenger and freight. And we've gotten to a point where it seems like the railroads aren't interested in competing with trucks for a lot of traffic. They've decided to focus on very concentrated pockets, serving super high volume customers in certain cities. And so you have intermodal trains that are going between New York and Chicago, LA and Chicago, New York and LA, and a few other terminals. But essentially, they would be happy to serve just those really large ports and then inland ports that receive those cars. And other sectors and smaller manufacturers and farmers, especially in middle America and smaller towns, are being left alone. They're being abandoned by the railroads. You may have someone who still wants to ship by rail, but the railroad has decided it's not a high enough profit margin. Go find yourself some trucks.
Doing less with less in order to maximize profits is already disturbing, but it becomes even more absurd when you zoom in. That's why we want you to listen to Michael Sussman, an entrepreneur turned rail planner who authored the 2021 Nevada State Rail Plan. In putting the plan together, Michael worked from the ground up, talking with hundreds of shippers about their needs instead of just deferring to the railroad corporations, who are clearly content to speed through the state without stopping almost at all, as you're about to hear.
We pinpointed 198 warehouses alongside the rail network in Nevada. There is only part of one of 198 warehouses that uses rail. The rest use truck. Even though their factory in Fremont, California is on a rail line, Tesla sends 75 tractor trailers every night of the year to their factory in Fremont, California, and return trips. That's 150 tractor trailer trips every night of the year. Almost every state is suffering from not enough local service and a lot of through traffic when it comes to the railroad industry. So you have to start with what are the realities? If you have confidential private conversations with people on the ground throughout the state, you get truth. You get truth about, hey, I can't ship from here to there. They won't pick up my goods here. If they pick it up, I can only go there.
In some places, the need for restoring rail service is so clear that the question of external costs like truck pollution and highway congestion don't even need to be factored in. This was the case in a series of rural towns in Minnesota, where the trucking costs were so much higher than rail that when rail service went away, the industries that sustained those towns also left, setting the towns on a long course of economic decline. In Minnesota, as in many other places after the deregulation of the 1970s and 80s, responsibility for this less profitable rural rail service fell on smaller railroads called short lines. Often these short lines were spun off from the major rail lines that used to serve and maintain these tracks. These short lines are often too small to maintain the infrastructure or sustain the service over the long run. Prior to this, the larger Class I railroads that operated on these rural routes had been able to use the profit from other higher volume lines to support this vital service. With public support, however, Minnesota has been able to restore and revitalize short-line service, and the benefits, as you're about to hear, are truly impressive. Mike Beard is a one-time railroad worker who spent 12 years in the Minnesota House of Representatives working across the aisle to restore rail service to those towns and others like them.
We're moving from east to west, rebuilding this line from 85-pound, 100-year-old rail and decrepit ties. We're now 54 miles down the line. We have 40-some miles to go with 115-pound welded rail, new ties, new ballast, reconfiguring all the trestles. Every town we come through, and we're through 7 or 8 of them now, the population decline has stopped. The retrenching or the decline of the tax base has stopped. And the amount of new private dollars being invested in those towns is going up, some cases pretty substantially. The ethanol plant was built in Winthrop, the new fertilizer plant in Fairfax. We lost a plant in Arlington, but it's been replaced by a potato processor. There's been a handful of smaller businesses that are pulling 5 or 6 cars a week. That's retail railroading. That's not unit train stuff. Just little things like that. Every town, the population decline has stopped. And you look at towns 10, 12 miles either side of it, small towns that have gone from 1,500 people to 1,200 people to 900 people over the last 30 years. The towns that are directly on our line are actually starting to increase. The decline has stopped and the increase has started again. And I've got that in black and white.
So it's true that shifting freight from roads to rails or trucks to trains would be hugely beneficial for all of us, or almost all of us. In fact, it could save the United States as much as $50 billion a year in those external costs from trucking that I mentioned before. But there is one major problem with that idea.
They are still emitting the same level of pollutants that they were when they were originally manufactured 30, 40, 50 years ago, despite the fact that there are cleaner models.
There were places where we monitored that would cause hospitalization if someone was outside for 3 hours.
Until you're in the room where 75% of the people in the room have had cancer in the respiratory tract, you understand how real it is, right? How many people are actually enduring that pain because of where they live.
U.S. locomotives are powered by diesel, and diesel emissions are extremely harmful, especially to the communities around rail yards, the enormous facilities where trains are sorted, loaded, and put together. Because in those places, the locomotive emissions are combined with the diesel emissions of thousands of trucks coming in and out of the rail yard. So increasing the amount of freight moving on trains without cleaning up the system increases the harm on those communities. And what's also disturbing about this is that there is every reason for the railroads to be using electricity to power their trains instead of diesel.
The United States is an outlier among many countries and among industrialized countries for how reliant its rail system is on diesel-powered locomotives.
This is Kevin Chen. At the time that we interviewed him, Kevin was a legal fellow with the National Resources Defense Council, or the NRDC.
And the reason behind that isn't solely technical, isn't solely economic, but is the result of choices that different stakeholders and actors have made over the course of decades. In contrast, other countries have relied on electrified rail for 100 years at this point. A lot of other countries have used overhead catenary wires to power their rail systems. They have much lower fuel costs, they have much lower operating costs as a result of having electric rail. Catenary has been the gold standard for rail operations in other countries for a long time.
For the last couple decades, advocates from those diesel-impacted communities I mentioned have been pressing for regulators to force the railroads to stop poisoning their communities. Finally, in 2024, they made a breakthrough, or actually a couple of breakthroughs, both of them in the state of California. Here's Yasmin Angelides, a lawyer with Earth Justice, who worked with community leaders on both of the efforts that resulted in new rules for cleaning up locomotive and rail yard-related emissions. By the way, you'll hear Yasmin use the acronym MFN. MFN stands for the Moving Forward Network. It's a national environmental justice, or EJ coalition, of over 50 organizations combating the harms of the U.S. freight transportation system. Solutionary Rail is a proud member of MFN, as are many of our guests in this series.
Some of our MFN partners out in Southern California have been actually asking our state air agency, the California Air Resources Board, to do something about rail for like 20 years. They have been demanding that there be some sort of cleanup. And for a long time, CARB was like holding off, trying to enter into these voluntary agreements with the railroads, really focusing their efforts elsewhere. And then now is finally looking at rail. So thankfully, CARB last year adopted the in-use locomotive regulation. It's the first zero-emission rail regulation ever adopted in the whole country. It's going to shift all locomotives that operate in California to zero emissions over time. And that includes freight, industrial, and passenger rail. It's going to have a really big impact. You know, the rule altogether at its peak will save 3,200 lives, and it's going to deliver $32 billion in health savings to the state. Another thing that's actually happened is the South Coast Air Quality Management District, our local air quality agency, also adopted a rail rule. So the first ever rail yard indirect source rule. An indirect source rule is something that tackles pollution from facilities that draw other sources of pollution. So if you think about a facility like an airport or a rail yard or a port, those are facilities that they themselves are not necessarily the polluting sources, but they're magnets for trucks, trains, ships that do have a lot of emissions. So our local air agency and air agencies across the country have the authority to adopt these indirect source rules. And the rail yard indirect source rule is the first of its kind. It's going to essentially implement CARB's statewide regulations in a way so that the benefits that the South Coast region receives are proportional to, what other parts of the state receive. The goal of that is really because we've seen that the rail industry might try to focus their efforts on other parts of the region and leave the Inland Empire and Los Angeles behind.
These places with enormous rail yards are often major freight hubs, meaning they also have a huge amount of trucks going between warehouses, ports, and even to and from the rail yards themselves. Electrifying the railroads would therefore enable freight to be taken off the roads without worsening the diesel impacts on the communities around rail yards. This is why electrification of rail and mode shift of freight off of trucks and onto trains are such interrelated issues.
From the port of LA and Long Beach to where I live, it's about 45 minutes to an hour. During primetime traffic, you're talking 3.5 hours. That's how many trucks are put on the road, right? That add to that area.
Here's Andrea Vidaurre, co-founder and policy analyst for the People's Collective for Environmental Justice, or PC for EJ, and recipient of the 2024 Goldman Environmental Prize.
A lot of that stuff could be moved by rail as well because we have rail tracks that are connected from the ports into our rail yards and out, and they go out into the rest of the country. The problem is that our rail yards are already so dangerous and toxic to the people that live there. But if we were able to have catenary line and actually clean it up, then the conversation could happen. I think it's really hard to have the conversation right now about any more things moving on those rail lines with the impacts that it has now.
You may recall that at the beginning of this episode, I mentioned how the railroad network could potentially double as a national supergrid for moving renewable energy. This was one of the central proposals of our 2016 book, and it was meant to address an issue that has become only more important in recent years, namely the vast disparity between our country's capacity to generate renewable energy and our capacity to actually get that energy to market. Today, there are literally thousands of renewable energy generation projects waiting for the green light to be built, but only a tiny portion of them have any prospect of breaking ground anytime soon. The problem is simple. In order to get energy to market, you have to build long-distance transmission lines across vast swaths of the country. And this requires buying up land from lots and lots of people who may not want to part with it. Besides being unpopular, it's a process that can get held up in the courts for years. The idea that we learned about from a guy named Alan Drake and then wrote about in our 2016 book is this. We already have this national network of rights-of-way, which, oh, by the way, was largely given to the railroad corporations by the federal government. So why not use that corridor for transmission? Co-locate electric transmission on railroad rights-of-way, electrify the railroads, and unlock renewable energy assets from all over the country. Seems like a no-brainer.
How are we going to get the energy, which is going to be largely renewables? How are we going to get that to market?
This country could move to a no net carbon economy.
Looking at the railroad network,
it's like an interstate highway that allows you to sell your electric energy to the big populations on the coast.
We got in touch with Alexander or Sandy McDonald, the former head of the Earth System Research Lab at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. Soon before we published our book, Sandy had published a study that found that the United States could move to an 80% non-carbon electric grid within 15 years, or at that time, by 2030. And the critical element of that was the build-out of a long-distance, high-voltage, direct current, or HVDC, transmission network across the country. Here's what Sandy said about our idea.
When I discovered Bill Moyers working on Solutionary Rail, it seemed like there's a really nice synergism because you can use the railroad right away, and the idea of electrified rail kind of fits very nicely with it. So in this sort of next giant national infrastructure project that's kind of on the scale of the railroads and the interstate highways, this country could move to a no net carbon economy if it had a national network of high voltage DC. You don't need a big advance in batteries. It's cheaper to use transmission, and the railroads make a very nice kind of synergistic part of this idea.
Co-locating HVDC transmission along the rail network could also be a major opportunity to work towards justice for Native American tribes. These tribes, for whom the railroads have a very complicated past as tools for genocide, have for over a century had these corridors running through their sovereign lands, endangering residents, and making billions for the railroads, but delivering very little for the people. Part of the opportunity is that when an increased use of an easement occurs, it should actually trigger a renegotiation or clarifying of the terms of the use of that easement. And that's partly why the addition of HVDC transmission on these rail corridors opens up opportunities for tribes to renegotiate a better deal. And what we've learned is that this is called right-of-way justice. The concept of right-of-way justice was introduced to us by our next speaker, Chris Stainbrook, longtime president of the Indian Land Tenure Foundation.
As you might expect, there's a very checkered past and feeling in Indian country around railroads. Our ancestors really saw them as kind of the undoing of Indian country. Over the years, the tribes have been more engaged in their letting of right-of-ways and easements on the reservations than they were in the past, where the Bureau of Indian Affairs may have handled the whole negotiation pieces around it. So what do the tribes get out of it besides money? If we're going to let people use the land, are we going to get some other benefit? For instance, electricity has come out of the WAPA system, the Western Area Power Administration system on the Missouri River, and it went across the reservations and none of it remained in the reservations. And so when that negotiation started, it was how do we get some of that power? The potential for solutionary rail and electrification of the system is you can place renewable sources of energy on tribal lands and then have access to the grid. Right now, it's prohibitively expensive to go to the grid, the high voltage grid where it's currently placed. And this would expand the ability of the tribes to utilize that and get something more out of the railroad right-of-ways that have been in place for now 130 years. From a tribal perspective, this would be an opportunity that fulfills their needs. And I think you'd see the tribes get behind it as opposed to any other activity that the railroad might do.
Alongside environmental justice communities and others advocating for a better rail system, are advocates from within the railroad industry itself.
It's like no other job. Most people can't even begin to understand what it's like, what's involved. It takes a special kind of person. And the industry is driving that out of people.
In 2023, they had hired as many as 143 conductors, and at the end of the year, there were only 48 of them left. It's not a lifestyle you want.
Their big thing is they want everything that gives them cover on their fake safety statements because they are an impediment to safety, these railroad companies.
I've personally buried 9 coworkers that I've worked with within 100 miles of my home, and only 3 of them got to retirement.
Between the job cuts, the cuts to maintenance, inspection, feelings of insecurity in terms of health and safety, the railroad proving itself to be diametrically opposed to your interests, I think railroad workers are ready to look for alternatives.
Railroad Workers United, or RWU, has been a pivotal catalyst among railroad workers for putting railroads back in the service of workers' interests and public interests as well. In an industry with labor fragmented into 13 different unions representing different crafts or types of work, RWU was formed to build industry-wide solidarity. RWU members have had a profound influence on Solutionary Rail's work. Their advocacy against chronic fatigue of workers caused by the absence of predictable schedules, their defense of a minimum 2-person crew against industry moves towards cutbacks and automation, and their encouragement of workers to exercise their right to strike have strengthened the backbones of union leadership and workers alike. Even though the President and Congress foiled the 2022 call for a strike, the leadership and public advocacy of RWU has forced most railroads to allow at least some paid sick leave for railroad workers, more than the 1 day that the President's Emergency Board had proposed. More recently, RWU launched a campaign for public ownership of the railroads, an idea with a surprising history in the United States and plenty of precedent around the world. Public ownership is one of a few ideas for restructuring the industry that we will explore in this podcast. In the next few clips, you'll get some sense of the dangerous mismanagement that railroad workers are subject to on a daily basis. But note something I think is truly remarkable. Throughout all our conversations with railroad workers, despite all the challenges they face, these workers are animated by a deep love of railroading and a desire to see the industry better serve the country. Check out what these RWU members have to say. The first clip will be from a 10-year veteran of the industry who requested not to be identified because of widespread retaliation against workers who speak out.
I love what I do. I love my crews. I love traveling. And I never thought I would work on the railroad or have this position. And over the years, the first 5 years was great. You know, there was safety risks, but not like there is now. They started PSR about 5 years ago. And that's when I started realizing that it's getting, it's got quite dangerous out there. We lose guys. I noticed in the last 6 months, we've lost 3, we call them orange hats. And we've lost 3 orange hats in the last year due to improper training, shortcuts on maintenance. We might bad order a car because of the brake cylinder not working, which is our stopping power. And it get put in the shop, and the shop where the manager might take the tag off and put it somewhere else. You know what I mean? They put it back out in the fleet. People think we make all this money and all. I'm gone a lot, though. My kids, I don't see my kids a lot because I'm out working for these guys 12 hours a day, at least. That's another thing. I work for 12 hours, right? I get paid. After that, I don't get paid anymore. So I could sit on a train for 19 hours. I'm not getting paid after 12 hours. And that happens all the time. They took the part away that a good employee wants to work hard. I want to work hard for my boss. If there's a manager for me that treats me right, I'll bust my ass for him. I will do a lot for him. I think I'm a pretty good worker. You know, I've made a good name for myself in the railroad. Just treat us like humans, you know, like give us the shit we need. When it's blatant out there that safety, that they don't give a shit about safety, then it's really hard to come to work. And I still do because I was raised that way. I'm still going to come to work and work my hardest. But it takes a lot out of you to do that.
Next, we'll hear from Marilee Taylor, who spent 34 years working as an engineer, brakeman, and conductor.
The experts are not sitting in some office building in a leather chair behind a desk. These are fools. We who work know they're fools. We have the intellectual capacity to actually run the railroads. I believe that we should nationalize the railroads without indemnification. And what I mean by that is we've paid the bill. We have paid the bill many, many thousands of times over. Warren Buffett should not get a single let me speak right in case you're going to put my voice on there. I should not get a dime.
And last but not least, Ron Kamenkow, co-founder and recently retired general secretary of RWU, in which he describes his vision for a publicly owned rail system.
Under the private ownership system that we currently have in the United States and Canada and Mexico, we've seen the number of railroad jobs diminish by tens and tens of thousands. Once again, there's no end in sight to this. The carriers have made it clear that they want to eliminate even more jobs, consolidate more facilities, gain even greater, quote, efficiencies by eliminating positions. Let's take an alternative view of a railroad that's publicly owned, where investment is made in double tracking, where the idea of the railroad is to move more freight in the nation's interest as opposed to moving less freight, which is in the interest of the stockholders. So now we have a railroad that is investing, that is double tracking, that is electrifying, gaining new traffic, running more passenger trains, winning traffic off the highways in terms of less than carload, express, mail, to say nothing of just loose carload traffic from lots and lots of small industries that years ago have given up on rail and decided to ship by truck. And that might be a carload a week or 3 carloads a month or 5 carloads a day. But these are all shipments that the railroad has poo-pooed and forfeited because they can't make 50 cents on the dollar. But if the railroad is publicly run, it has the ability to become this robust rail network because we're actively courting shippers. We're actively trying to win shippers away from the highway so that loads are moved that might only garner 10 cents on the dollar. It's still profitable. It's still doable. And this is a different model that could be implemented, but the Class 1s have made it clear that they have no interest in running a railroad of this nature. So what happens to the workforce under these conditions? Jobs expand in both freight and passenger service. And in an expanded environment of this nature, morale necessarily goes up. Worker discontentment, I would postulate, would go down. And there's a sense and a feeling that you are in an industry that is moving forward, and it is moving forward, and it's serving the nation's shippers, the nation's passengers. It's reducing billions of tons of CO2 emissions into the environment by simply moving freight off of inefficient highway transportation onto way more efficient rail transportation. People can restore a sense of pride in their work and their jobs, and the entire country can be potentially like reunited together because the understanding that we have this great thing called the biggest railroad network in the world that is now put at the disposal and the interest of the American people, as opposed to just a handful of rich investors for their own private gain. So it all fits together. More workers, more production, more freight moved, shipper contentment, more passenger trains, more people riding the rails, more people appreciating the nature of rail, coming to understand it, see it as something that can revitalize their rural community, for example. All of these things can combine, I think, so that the interests of workers, shippers, trackside communities, passengers, the environment, and the nation's economy, it all sort of comes together around a revitalized rail system.
We all know that we live in polarized times, but at Solutionary Rail, we think that railroads may just be the antidote that is needed. It's not just that freight and passenger rail have enormous potential for revitalizing rural towns that have been disenfranchised and abandoned by our globalized economy, although that's part of it. It's also that railroads seem to transcend political divisions and provide an opportunity to find common cause. We'll be delving into this and more in the next few episodes.
We are all connected on this question. Our communities extend from the 2 people in the cab of a locomotive to every single community that we traverse through on our railroad.
People were almost glad to have something that they could come together and vote on that didn't cause them to have great angst or have protesters on their front lawn when they went home at night. Nobody protested when you voted to rebuild a railroad bridge somewhere. It was It was almost refreshing to have something that was not inflammatory.
These are deeply conservative rural counties, yet they have recognized that there is value in passenger rail, and if anything should give us a sense of hope and optimism, I would hope that some of these accomplishments that we've been able to pull off in the past few years would be that beacon of hope, that light at the end of the tunnel that folks might be looking for right now.
Please join us in the coming weeks and months as we learn about U.S. railroads, a fascinating infrastructure that goes unnoticed and thus unharnessed for the solutions it could potentially provide. Reconnect America is a podcast by Solutionary Rail. This episode was written by Sasha Alenko and me, Bill Moyer. Audio engineering and production is by August Moore, and percussion score by yours truly. Special thanks to Ken Jacobson for the theme music. You can find this show on Substack, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may have noticed that this podcast doesn't have ads or a paywall. With your help, we can keep it that way. We're not here to sell you anything. We are here to build a movement.